Good evening, everyone, and welcome to Psychosocial Wednesdays. My name is Stefano Carpani. I am an Italian sociologist and a psychoanalyst trained at the Carl Gustav Jung Institute in Zurich. With Bernard von Goretzky and Paula Taniello, we created this initiative. More than a century ago, Freud organized the famous Wednesdays meeting that opened the world of psychoanalysis to a wide range of ideas. We, Bernard, Paul, and myself, have created an online digital salon molded on those Wednesdays. We will feature Jungian and post-Jungian ideas, but we'll also include speakers from other fields, traditions, and schools, including relational, feminist, psychosocial, liberation, and existential psychologies. Some of you might wonder why we call this salon psychosocial instead of psychoanalytical. Well, this is because following Stefan Frosch, psychosocial studies seek to investigate the ways in which psychic and social processes demand to be understood as always implicated in each other, as mutually constitutive, co-produced, or abstracted levels of a single dialectical process. Also, this is to honor those that in the past 20 or 30 years tried to bridge the social and the psychic. Among those, Ian Cripe, Susie Orbach, Jessica Benjamin, Mary Watkins, Lynn Layton, Stefan Frosch, and of course, Andrew Samuels. Now, I am about to introduce our first guest. In 2 weeks, we will have a new guest, and we will try to do this every second week. Our next guest is Tom Singer. So on May 20th, come back, same time, same place, Tom Singer. Now, I'm very, very happy to introduce our first guest, Susan Rowland. She will talk about past plagues, present psyche, finding resilience, creativity, joy in the time of coronavirus, with a little help from Carl Gustav Jung. Susan is professor at Pacifica Graduate Institute and has published books on Jung, gender, creativity, and the arts. Her last project is on Jungian art-based research. Welcome, Susan.
Thank you very much, Stefano, and also thank you to Bernard and Paul. I'm very honoured to be at the opening of this wonderful initiative. Well, fear not, it's not going to be a lecture. I'm going to present 4 provocative points that I hope will generate questions and reactions from you, the audience. The 4 points are that pastness is a potentially creative, progressive way of revisioning the present. And that is shown in Jung's work, perhaps in spite of his conservative social leanings. And pastness, in this sense, includes history, obviously. The fact that this isn't the first pandemic that many of us can remember, thinking back to, for example, the AIDS pandemic, and also that we have a history of plagues and various reactions to them. But pastness also includes myth, and the Jungian tradition has a very kind of rich history of work around myth that many people today are bringing into our current situation. My second point is that pastness is not just the past as we typically understand it, it also includes past forms of knowledge. And that we need to be thinking about past and marginalized forms of knowledge in relation to the kinds of knowledge that Western modernity has promoted and valorized. My third point is, how do we kind of try to integrate past forms of knowledge? Well, I propose that Jungian arts-based research, which builds on the extraordinary work around art done by Jungians, but is not the same thing, that Jungian arts-based research has a contribution to make in integrating knowledge in particular ways. And my fourth point is that a creative and joyful way of bringing all the preceding points together is to take a Dionysian framework, both to what is happening to us and to the way in which we might be able to remember our human and human integrating with nature world. Okay, so pastness, a tool to reimagining the present. One of my favorite quotes from Jung is his one about blood-sucking ghosts. He says in the 1933 book that blood-sucking ghosts are those modern people who have no relationship to the past. And I think it's interesting now, post the publication of the Red Book, to link that remark about blood-sucking to the ghosts in the Red Book who are in great need of blood and say they come to the I figure and say, give me blood. And the comment is made about these ghosts that they did not live their animal. This is a rather illuminating comment, I would suggest, in terms of where we are with the coronavirus and this question of living the animal, especially in the very precise sense that the coronavirus is a species jumper, and that we have a kind of that the coronavirus itself is a kind of hybrid animal-human entity. It's also, I think, helpful if we kind of imagine, or if we use that term blood-sucking ghosts, to think about the people we're faced with today. Chief blood-sucking ghost, in my view, is the President of the United States. And, you know, the hyper-capitalists who we're beginning to see are exploiting the virus with no sense of the animal, of the physical, natural needs of the people. It reminds us that in the term pandemic, there is an old god, Pan. And for example, my friend Mary Wood has written on the Pacifica blog about the Pan in the pandemic, and how the notion that Great Pan is dead seems somewhat premature, given that this figure, who in mythology was part goat, part humanoid, again expresses this kind of physical nature of the virus as it's transmitted from the animal world into the human world, changing us. I also want to point just briefly to the way myth in Jungian depth psychology has been reimagined for progressive, creative purposes, in particular by women scholars. So that out of the feminism that was so necessary 40, 30 years ago and is still necessary today, we have some very powerful and powerfully attractive work on what it means to be a woman today, based on looking back at myths like the myth of Artemis or the myth of Athena, for example, And here I want to pay tribute to the work of Jeanette Paris and Christine Downing. So there's a sense in which we Jungians have a history of using myth for progressive purposes. And that too might be interesting in looking at the way in which a pastness around Pan and the pandemic could be a helpful way of trying to reimagine where we are and where we might choose to go. Because of course, what is so crucial to Jungian psychology is the sense of the richness of the unconscious and the sense that we need not to be swallowed up by it, that we need not to be a tool of deeper impulses that we cannot control. Such a wonderfully complex vision of our relationship to nature that includes human nature. So I'm going to move on to a comment that I heard in the media quite a lot in the early days of the lockdown. This could not have been predicted. And of course, as we know, this was predicted a lot. It was predicted by various sciences, particularly epidemiology. It was also predicted by astrology. And I want to bring into the same space astrology, which is has an extremely long history and is alive and well today, particularly for Jungians as archetypal astrology. And also, let's remember that astrology has a multicultural dimension. People who refuse to countenance any astrology are also refusing to countenance cultures far from Western modernity, or not far from Western modernity. And then the kinds of knowledge that we regard as modern, the kinds of knowledge that our culture privileges, the way in which the term science is being used today in the media. Science is being used to reassure us. We will do what the science says, etc., etc. And no doubt that is in many ways reassuring. But what does it mean in which you have these two very different types of knowledges predicting a pandemic in 2020? It points to a situation in knowing that is something that I've become interested in, but in particular, I think is anticipated in Jungian depth psychology. I think Jungian depth psychology anticipates this great crisis and this great possibility. Because if we think about it, having astrology in the same room as science, what possibly can connect them? Well, one of the things that connects them is Jungian psychology. We all know that Jung was interested in astrology, and my friends and colleagues, Kieran Lee Grice and Saffron Rossi, have published much more evidence and discussion of the large amount of Jung's interest in astrology. So there is that real kind of connection between astrology, archetypal astrology, and the depth psychology. Of course, depth psychologists from Jung onwards have been very interested in science and various modern types of science, and looking at the scientific methodology, looking at the subject-object split, and how we can sort of think of depth psychology in more respectably scientific terms. And I know that there's been important research in this area. So we have these two somewhat incompatible ways of knowing that have been connected through depth psychology. So I want to just revision this situation into a bigger picture. And the bigger picture is, if we call science these modern ways of knowing based on the subject-object split, and we call tradition the collection of knowledges that are actually based on a holistic vision, an integrated vision of humans, nature, cosmos. These knowledges will include all the knowledges derived from traditional religions, knowledges derived from body practices like yoga, what is known as tacit knowing, embodied knowing, knowledges like astrology and alchemy and magic and spellcraft, many indigenous knowledges. So if we have this dichotomy, which we do have, between this thing called tradition and this thing called science, which is the kind of knowledge that our culture has privileged, we then come to a situation where it's not just depth psychology that's beginning to see that these are not entirely incompatible. And what this might inaugurate through complexity theory, which is, as many of you know, complexity theory is a new theory of evolution that talks about change being driven not by single species, but by interlocking environments. And if complexity theory can expand to see not only one level of reality, the natural world, as complexly interacting, but actually multiple levels of reality, including the sacred, as complexly interacting. A vision of complexity that Jungians have embraced, such as Helene Schulman and Joseph Cambray, then we actually are looking at what has been called transdisciplinarity, which means multiple disciplines, multiple ways of knowing, related but not combined, not condensed into some one overall level of knowing. This is transdisciplinarity, not multidisciplinarity. Multidisciplinarity is lots of different ways of knowing. Transdisciplinarity in this vision is a revision of hierarchical knowing, with science at the top and astrology at the bottom, into a kind of web, a multiplicity where there is no hierarchy. And this is knowledge as open. There will be new knowledge as yet undreamt of that will come into this. And knowledge has to be written in symbols, because a symbol is an image or a word that is open to revision, that is open to what is not yet known. Now, I've just been describing the work of Basarab Nicolescu, including the thing I've just said about written in symbols. It is fascinating and really powerful, I think, that he describes transdisciplinary knowing as written in Jungian symbols. Doesn't cite Jung, of course, but Jung's vision of the symbol in words is the way of this new way of knowing. Now, why might we want this new way of knowing? We might want it because it has social consequences. There is a relation, as we know, between how a culture organizes knowledge and how it organizes power. One image of that relationship is Merlin. Knowledge has a relationship to power, and a complex relationship to power. hierarchical knowledge is related to and in part sustains hierarchies of power. If we truly want a multicultural world and an ecological world, then we have to do away with hierarchies of knowing, and some knowing being marginalized and some being valorized. And in my view, and I've written about this, Jung anticipates a lot of this idea about different levels of reality and different types of knowing. Okay, I'm going to be very quick now because I don't want to take up time that other people could better use. But one of the things that transdisciplinarity hasn't yet really explored is the way in which tradition, remember it has all these knowledges, including the knowledges going from religion, tradition also includes the arts. The arts have traditions. The arts are deeply implicated in various traditions and are often interested and hospitable to different past knowledges. And in the last couple of decades, in the world of academic research, a new paradigm has emerged called arts-based research, in which making art is a research activity. It's not art about research. It's not research that then leads to art in order to communicate it. It is doing art as research. Now, this is something that Jungians can really get behind, because what are artists doing when they are making art? And I'm not talking just about painting, but about all arts. What are they doing? They're working with images. They're working with psychic images in the way in which Jungians have been doing so in a different context. I think that Jungian arts-based research informed by Jungian ideas and principles, is a kind of equivalent to psychotherapy, in that psychotherapy is two people in a room, and Jungian arts-based research is doing that therapy in and for the culture. It is a way of taking the psychotherapy out of the room and doing it with the world, the culture. That sounds very vague, but arts-based research has many dimensions, and one of them is critical activist research. That people do political activism through doing art with, for example, marginalized communities or suffering communities. There are lots of examples of this. Okay. So I could say much more about that. I could, for example, say we could understand the value of arts-based research in looking at a play like Hamlet, for example. But I want to say something briefly about Dionysus. Dionysus, the god of comedy and the god of tragedy. And I think we have a lot of comedy and tragedy around the coronavirus. And by the way, I am not talking about Greek myth as the only way of understanding archetypes. It just happens to be the one that I can use without it being appropriation. Dionysus was described by James Hillman as marking a transition basically between Jung's rather monotheistic version of individuation and Hillman's preferred polytheistic version of individuation. That Dionysus is a dismembering of the old god of modernity, and we're certainly getting dismembering of old gods right now, and a remembering of parts, body parts as parts, which relate to each other but are not actually stitched together into another monotheistic god. And that this would be a bodily instinctual consciousness. Now, I think that this is a very interesting story to imagine what transdisciplinarity could be, particularly transdisciplinarity infused with Jungian psychology, that the old body of knowledge with its hierarchies and marginalizations and repressions is dismembered, and then it is remembered in a new relationship to nature. It is our bodies, our instinctual base that is so threatened by the coronavirus, as we are threatened by all the dark plutonic information that is coming to us, but also that whole unknown, unconscious underworld associated with death. And it is breaking down traditional old structures in our society. But there is also a huge outpouring of creativity around this in the arts and in elsewhere, and a huge desire to remember our society, our world, and our relationship to nature very, very differently, in a way that would reduce the hierarchy or point us towards something more like a kind of web of relationships. So this would be a new Dionysian consciousness in which the bodily instinctual side is connected to joy. It would be far more multicultural, multi-religious, multi-ethnic. And it would be a desire to remake our relationship to the planet and its ecologies. That's my talk. Stefano and team, over to you.
Thank you, Susan. Please do send us questions. I know that you might need a couple of minutes. Send them to me directly or through the chat. I would like to start with a question. When you were talking about blood-sucking ghosts, this book came to my mind.
Yes.
Lament of the Dead by Shamdasani and James Hillman. You underline that knowledge has to be written in symbols, and that knowledge is linked to power. I wonder whether knowledge is about insights, being able to get insights, like in analysis, for example. I will do a little tour because the other day I was reading an article by Michel Houellebecq, the French writer, who said, the world will be same but worse after a banal virus. My question for you, actually, I opened this book like you do with each, and there is a question from Shamdasani to Hillman. The question is, what do you see that art can offer to psychology? I changed the question. The original question was, what do you see that literature can offer to psychology? But I ask you, what do you see that art can offer to psychology?
Thank you. My answer is that art is materialized images. So what art offers psychology is a way of working with the psyche that can go out into the world. It is, I'm not ignoring the fact that art is multicultural and different and changes over time and all the rest of it. If I'm suggesting that if there's some kind of essence to art wherever it occurs, it is the psychic image and the desire to for that psychic image to go out into the world and have its own being. That the image of the artist will go out into the world, and it may be connected back to the artist by people receiving that image or not. But the point is, it will have its own being, it will have its own life. And it is the way, one of the most powerful ways the psyche, beyond the individual, wants to explore the collective. So it's that. It's arts-based research takes psychotherapy into the public domain.
Thank you. I see many people agreeing with you, but not so many sent questions. Please do so. Let me ask you a question from someone. What would you want to find if we took all these traditions seriously? This question refers to what you said at the beginning of your conversation.
Well, I think we would find knowledges that are not tradition being enriched. One of the things that I think provoked the development of the idea of transdisciplinarity was Professor Niculescu, who's actually a quantum scientist, discovering that some of the things that were being discussed in quantum science were also visible in medieval theology. And he's not the only person to recognize that. I was introduced to transdisciplinarity by Gregorius, and I'm so sorry I can't remember his surname, but he was a student at Essex and did a wonderful PhD on a different medieval theologian, and it's linked to depth psychology and transdisciplinarity. So I think there is the potential enriching this notion that, I've been in academia for a long time, and disciplines kind of fight each other. And it's just a waste of time and energy that we can't afford. Let me put it in more clinical terms. When I was diagnosed with hard-to-treat clinical depression, my psychiatrist showed me a list of treatments that the National Health Service of the UK approved of. And I said, do they work? And he said, about 50%. That's not good enough. We need to do things better. And that should include looking at knowledges that have survived into our times because they are effective.
We have two questions, actually three. First one is from Leslie. I guess Leslie, hi Leslie, is in the UK, and it's amazing. People from the UK, from the US, Europe, South America, Asia, thank you so much. We are 100, we set the limit at 100 because we thought a couple of people would actually connect. We will have to put this up to 200. Truly apologize for those that were not able to connect. So Leslie, I am reading your question. Material art must be in specific time and place, no? So how can there be an essential image as it were? I mean, an image in medieval time has extremely different impact and meaning. I hope I interpret your question correctly, Leslie.
It's a great question. I disagree with it. Leslie is of course right that there is an aspect of art that is culturally located, but that is not the meaning of the work of art. And Jung is actually very interesting on this. He points that the meanings of works of art change over time, and that art that is suffused with the collective unconscious can actually tell us things that people don't consciously know. If we believe the unconscious exists, then it must be possible for someone to create a work of art that has potential meaning that goes beyond the conscious mind of the artist. So Jung suggested that given the collective unconscious, that art could be in some way prophetic, not all of it, but some of it, particularly that drew very heavily on unconscious energies. He also suggested that a work of art could be to the collective the way a dream is to the individual. If you like, that's my core basis for arguing that arts-based research can be a kind of collective psychotherapy. Yes, a work of art will say certain things to the period in which it is composed, but it may continue to be loved or hated and rethought down the centuries.
We have a question from Italy now, from Paolo. Ciao, Paolo. I hope you're fine. I like to know something more about the relation between pan and actual pandemic situation. Thank you.
I'm not particularly well versed in the literature of Pan. I know that Pan is a particularly dangerous spirit of nature, and that as I read in my friend Mary Wood's blog, he was born as part goat and part humanoid and was rejected for this terrible kind of ugliness and affront. And that very much speaks to the coronavirus. One could say that Pan is a god that is extremely violent and extremely seductive. We have Pan pipes, but we also have Pan as in panic. Another friend, also an Essex graduate, Suki Fonteu, published a wonderful book, Pan in America, that looked at Pan in things like school shootings. And I think that's a very powerful way of looking at something that is so hard to imagine, a school shooting, children being killed, perhaps by other children. She also noted that Pan was a way that the Native Americans were constructed in the early years. And we have to, we have to confront our past as a place of great suffering that perhaps we still bear some responsibility for. It is possible that Pan, exploring Pan and the stories of Pan may help us.
We have now 11 questions. I will try to read them all. We have 20 minutes. Maybe we can get a few additional minutes. So I will read them first come, first serve. Now we have Christine. You clarified the difference between transdisciplinarity and multidisciplinary. What would be the difference, if any, with interdisciplinary?
Yes, interdisciplinarity is an idea that you can combine two disciplines without any problem. It tended not to work very well because a lot of interdisciplinary work, if you examine it, is actually more located in one discipline than the other. And the material of the other discipline is marginalized. Quick example, there's been a very interesting development of relationships between literature and history, and but it's still the case that historians will write about literature as if it would just illustrated a historical point, which is not the way in which literary critics think about works of literature.
Andrew Summers from London. May I draw you out on the function of anger and angry images? Politically engaged art is often angry art. Psychosocial studies is also fueled by anger. Can arts-based research take a look at the positive relation between anger and creativity?
Absolutely, and a lot of it does. There's, you know, I've been working on relating existing research and arts-based research and Jungian studies. One way of looking at arts-based research is in 4 divisions. One of those is critical activist art, which does not have to be angry, but certainly could be motivated by it. I think anger, I don't feel particularly qualified to talk about anger because I haven't really kind of studied emotions separate from works of art. But angry art is often transformational art. But not all transformational art is angry. It seems likely that the growth of the 18th century novel made a huge difference to how marriage was reimagined in the 19th century. That it was the 18th century novel written by women from women's point of view that changed attitudes to marriage and actually suggested, shock horror, that women might get a choice in their life partners. So I'm not feeling very confident about anger, but it is definitely an important part of critical activist arts-based research.
Question from Dennis. A virus is a ghost in being like a soft wiring taking over a cell. That is analogous to the modern corporation being a human creation form that is destroying the planet. What Jung would call a modern day monster, a monster now controlling the planet?
Well, I think it's the blood-sucking ghosts. We might be thinking about various kind of mythical structures for this. We would be thinking, why would we want to think mythically here? And, you know, a reason might be that a myth might actually enable us to think better, to go further. So are the corporations titanic? Are the corporations themselves a particularly destructive side of Pan or Hades or Pluto or Uranus, or all sorts of, there are all sorts of possibilities. I think the sense of the virus here in what Dennis has said enables us to think differently and perhaps more clearly about corporations.
We have a question from Arturo. Can you ask Susan to elaborate on astrology and yoga and how she connects these to her discipline?
Well, I'm a fan of astrology without being knowledgeable. The reason I'm a fan is that I find it a meaningful language, a meaningful symbolic language for emotions and events, a meaningful way of reading the world. Since I come from a tradition of literature and in particular fiction, you know, I like having various symbolic languages without having to be invested in a very conscious way in any of them. In terms of the way in which astrology connects the unconscious image through thinking about planets as archetypal or archetypes, that then would be implicated in various disciplines of yoga. But that's about as far as I can go on that.
2 more questions on astrology. You know, we don't have a team that is putting all the questions together, so
Yeah.
we're trying to do this live. Is the corona representing a chance to connect psychology, psychotherapy, and astrology? From Tamara and from Stefani. When you ask what to do, science and astrology in the same room share, I'm just wondering if the rejection of the past rather than simply not remembering the past has been a reckoning with respect to the virus. Thanks, Susan, very much for your sharing.
Right. Yes. Well, I'm not sure quite all the things I was being asked there. I think certainly it is a forgetting of the past is problematic for where we are. Here I want to kind of bring in the historical sense of a pandemic, and those of us who lived through the AIDS pandemic, and that is a dimension that I think, you know, could be usefully brought into the discussion of where we are now and how we are facing the terrors of now, and also whether anything positive or creative might have come out of that terrible time. And so the sense in which astrology speaks to past forms of consciousness, that it contains within itself a language that speaks to other forms of consciousness, then I think it is potentially very valuable.
We have a question from Sandra. Adding to what Susan says, ritual art expresses the images of dreams, myth, and symbols. In this way, the image as psyche is a container of numinous, with the potential to transform and heal, both the personal and collective. In this way, art joins with psychology. I guess this is not a question. I guess this is for a spin-off.
But it enables me to say that, you know, we, in Western modernity, we've divided things up. And that has worked quite well in some ways and really badly in other ways. And so the link between art practice, art experience, and healing is well known. And is being developed by psychotherapy, but also by other medical and healing traditions. So that there is a sense that this ancient past knowledge and modern clinical practices are already drawing together, and that might be something that is even more important in the time of a coronavirus.
Next question from Lee. How is your idea about the necessity to turn art into social construction different from Jung's active imagination? You could spend 3 hours on this question. I give you 1 minute maximum.
Yes, well, I try to remind my students that Jung conceived of active imagination as a therapy in a therapeutic context, that he did not wish to extend it to art. And there is a discussion to be had there about why and how. On the other hand, if you talk to artists, a lot of them do a lot of active imagination all the time. You know, novelists work with characters as figures that are talking to them in their heads. Painters will often report practices that are quite close to active imagination. So there is a kind of rich interconnected field. And the whole point about transdisciplinarity is it doesn't try to collapse one activity or way of knowing into another. It says, let them have a relationship without becoming the same thing.
From Nicholas, given your comments on art as an outward expression to communicate the collective psyche, I note that some art appears in a sacred context context with limited access via initiation, etc. How might we relate these restricted art to the collective in a meaningful way?
Well, initiation is a collective way of relating to art. And if we want to change a tradition of initiation, then we should be asking ourselves a lot of questions about ethics and social context and why. I don't think that an artwork being restricted takes it out of the collective. It places conditions on how one might access it. It may be that this is art that is only to be accessed by men, but I wouldn't necessarily say, take it out of that cave and give it to me. We have to respect, it's fundamental to Jungian psychology that we respect the autonomy of the image. That means we respect the autonomy of the art. The art itself has its own being and should be respected. We may not know that being. In fact, we definitely don't know all of that being. And we should respect what we don't know about the art.
Rola Maria, during this pandemic, we find ourselves collectively waiting for a savior in the form of knowledge. But with all the uncertainty around, all our basic assumptions are being challenged and even destroyed. We don't know what to believe, which science works, which historical pattern to detect, whether there will be a vaccine, etc. Could uncertainty then be playing a role in dismembering and remembering, result in a new Dionysian consciousness?
That's what I think is possible. And I think that it is valuable to try and imagine it. I'm not saying, Dionysus has arrived, let's just stand back and let him do his work. I'm saying that this mythical structure, this story, is a way of imagining what is happening and a way of imagining what could be possible that might be sustaining, powerful, insightful, and above all, joyful, because it gives us a sense of hope and purpose and possibility. We are clearly in a time of dismembering, and we are going to remember, and we can see people in power wanting to just turn a switch and get us back to where we were a year ago. A time of great and increasing injustice. It doesn't have to be that way, and there are many, many people and organizations that are trying to remember differently. And I think Jungian depth psychology is potentially at the heart of this.
From Lisa, Susan, would you say that transdisciplinarity and complexity perspectives demonstrate how bodies of knowledge are not separate in a larger or greater objective sense? In other words, is it the idea that art and psychology are systems that provide different views into a larger field of knowledge or meaning?
Yes.
From Naomi, does anyone remember the name of the Spanish Jungian who wrote on pen? And certainly joy. I don't know if you do. I will ask the group to write me and we can send this to Naomi. Yeah. She also writes, so sorry, the name as well as the name of the book escapes me just now, but perhaps I can get back to Stefan.
I'm sure somebody would write in the chat box for this, and we would all be grateful.
We can be connectors.
Yeah.
Catriona, COVID-19 is forcing us to all change very quickly. It is breaking down a lot of old structures. You suggest that the remembering can give rise to a new Dionysian consciousness. I suppose what I'm worried about more that Western culture doubles down and tries to go back to the old hierarchies. Can Jungians and depth psychology be midwives to the new way of thinking? That's amazing. Just say yes.
Well, let's hope so. Let us hope so. I'm sure that many in this gathering want to be part of a new and better way of thinking. And I'm just adding a few ingredients to the discussion that we're all having.
And if I can add something, midwives is really a beautiful, beautiful method.
It is. And that, I think that feminine touch there is also important. And we have the name of the book. We have the name of the author and the book, Rafael Pedraza, and I'm not going to play with the computer here, but we have the name.
Thank you for those that answered the question. Now we should start a quiz as well next time. From Shmuel Bernstein, a patient of mine dreamt that he is approaching the open market in Jerusalem and being bothered by many rats. He attacks them and they are going to complain to the woman, which is human right keeper, and she warns him. I asked him whether he have read The Plague by Camus, and he said he didn't read it.
Well, rats have been blamed for a lot of plagues. They were blamed, I think, for centuries for the bubonic plague in Europe, and then it was the fleas, and then it may have been the rats again. They seem to be the animal that, like the virus itself, is too close to humans and a danger to humans as they imagine themselves, as we imagine ourselves, completely separate from the natural world.
We have a few more questions before we will end this. Maybe we can extend it a few minutes. From Gary, we are still fractioned by a kind of political schism that endangers lives with misinformation. How can depth psychology both address this phenomenon and help to heal the rift?
Well, I think depth psychology, Jungian psychology, is essential because the danger of a lot of the misinformation is that people want to believe it, that people are being fed things that they accept because they want to, or because they're so frightened that they hang on to this kind of illusions that they're being fed. I noticed in the newspaper this morning there is a calculation that 60,000 lives in the United States have been lost to the virus because of misinformation. So this is very serious, and it is the seductiveness of blood-sucking ghosts that we need to be careful of. And I think Jungian psychology is particularly positioned to address the way in which the unconscious seduces people through their fears, their insecurities, and what they need to hang on to, particularly if they are in a culture that they know does not care for them, does not look after them.
Again, Naomi, she writes, von Franz, in writing on the neglected feminine, writes that the danger is that Mother Nature will get in a fury and release a virus. She actually says virus, Naomi underlines, that will spread quickly and is heretofore unknown. She writes, it is a matter of note in the feminine in fairy tales, the feminine in fairy tales, yes. Joel Fernando is telling us that in Brazil there are more than 1.7 million people infected. A question from William. What is the relationship between Dionysian remembering and remembering in the sense of recollection?
Dionysian remembering reconfigures consciousness as more bodily and instinctual in ways that it has not been or not been constructed by the dominant forces in Western modernity. So it's not just let's recall where we were and who we were. It is constructing a new kind of consciousness could be constructed if we remember in depth. And one of the ways of remembering in depth is to realign our knowledges so that we're not putting everything on one kind of knowledge, but actually considering other kinds of knowledge. I mean, I'm thinking about a heroic figure at the moment in the United States, Dr. Fauci, who clearly comes from dominant scientific knowing. But the reason he's so important right now is not the papers he published, but the kind of personality he is. And the kind of effect he's having on personalities in the government. Now, that is an example of how kinds of knowledge that he exemplifies, sort of human, psychological, social, compassionate knowledge. It's not being recognized officially, but it is essential to where we are now.
The very, very last two questions before Zoom is cutting us out. Would Susan explain how depth psychological orientation to art and art making helps us get our house back on our phylogenetic ground, while saying a bit more about how the past has to do with the invisible portion of dueling and the Dionysian? A big question, isn't it?
Yes. Well, Jung was trying to make modernity more whole by addressing what had been forgotten or repressed, to construct a modern consciousness that he rightly felt was exceedingly brittle. And he saw things like the Nazis as a result of the fragility of modern Western consciousness. What I see in his work overall is a wonderful paradox, which is a desire to promote the feminine back into modernity, the feminine in terms of the unconscious, the body, creativity, the arts, relationality, feeling, connectedness, promoting the feminine, and basically not really thinking about women at all. Women could kind of stay in their place as far as Jung was concerned, but the feminine had to be restored into modernity. And Dionysus is a very kind of bisexual god. And that the kind of consciousness that is depicted by James Hillman and also by Karenyi in his book on Dionysus is a consciousness that's in touch with Zoe as a spirit of joy and life, one that is too much for the physical human frame. We have to be Ariadne, who marries Dionysus. Ariadne is the human soul, is the ensouled world with the feminine back in place. We're all Ariadne, and we all need to marry Dionysus.
How do you feel, Susan?
I feel privileged, and it's lovely to see people I know. I can only see a very limited number of our guests on this screen, but I can see friends of mine, and I can see people that I've never met, but whom I've admired for many decades. And so I'm very privileged to be here. Thank you, Stefano and Bernard and Paul.
Thank you, because when we asked you 2 weeks ago, you said yes straight away. And it's late for us, at least here in Europe. We can say that perhaps this was the first global digital salon for Jungians and non-Jungians. We are still 100. We will do our best to increase the number of access. For the future, we will post these on our YouTube channel very soon after a little bit of editing. In 2 weeks, Tom Singer will be here. Then Polly Young-Eisendrath, then Andrew Samuels, then many others. I don't want to tell you all the names, but we have a schedule packed until Christmas. So be ready for the next 6 months to enjoy our Psychosocial Wednesdays, and good night.